Is it possible that we are approaching unemployment all wrong, the wrong way round? With the jobless rates in South Africa at crisis levels, what role can grants play in building a more inclusive economic model for the country? On Monday, the SA Tide program, in partnership with independent online economic policy newsletter Econ 3x3, will host the first installment of a new policy debate series. Panelists are going to be analyzing the success of grant-based approaches in other developing countries and draw lessons for the current South African discussion. Let's find out more now about his contribution. That's Professor Haroon Bhorat, Director of the Development Policy Research Unit at the University of Cape Town School of Economics. Prof, good afternoon. Welcome to today, and thank you very much for your time. Some people would think it's a timely discussion we are having because the world is completely different than what it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and we're still battling with high rates of unemployment. So the time is right to rethink the traditional approaches we've had to tackling unemployment.
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, I think what we will try and do on Monday in the debate is really have a further discussion about whether a new grant, so essentially what we have is a social relief of distress grant that the president introduced in May 2020, which has now been rolled over 4 times, can potentially act as a driver of labor market activity, be that employment, be that starting a new business. And some of the research we've done suggests that the picture, unfortunately, may be a little bit more complex than sort of simply extending the grant and making it a permanent feature of the fiscal landscape.
Yeah, I have this question which sometimes crops up in my mind because I'm not a numbers guy. I'm thinking we've got the social distress grant relief, the COVID one. We have child grants. We've got grants for the aged. We've got so many different grants. How about pulling all of them into one? I don't know what your research is showing, because the talk and the calls are growing for a universal basic income grant.
Yeah, so I think part of our challenge is to try and separate the campaigning from what the data shows us. And so the work we've done, sort of a careful econometric study, looking at the introduction or looking at SRD grant recipients relative to those who didn't get the SRD, but they must have very similar characteristics, a sort of standard approach in this kind of literature. And what we find is that the introduction of the SRD increased initially the probability of being employed by about 3% relative to somebody who didn't get the grant, which was then positive news. But as you go through the labor force surveys 1 year down the line, that grant has absolutely no impact on employment outcomes relative to somebody who didn't have a grant. And so in many ways, the longer run effects of the SRD on the labor market, on increasing the probability of employment, is actually zero. And so you then pivot, which is exactly your point, right? You then pivot to a question which says, okay, what are we trying to solve for? Because if we're trying to solve for employment, at least on the basis.
Oh, sorry, we've lost your sound there. Sorry, Prof, we can see you talking. I don't know if you've gone on mute accidentally or the connection is low. Apologies for that. Are you there?
Okay.
Yes.
I'm still here.
Yeah, I can hear you now. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. Just we have an unstable connection of the internet at the moment. Yeah, you can carry on.
So the point being that in the long run, it's unclear that the grant will actually increase employment outcomes, at least on the basis of our evidence. So it then begs the question, what are we trying to solve for with the SRD? And it comes back to your point, which is, okay, well, then if we're trying to solve for poverty, is the SRD necessarily the best instrument? So here's another thought experiment. What about doubling the value of other grants and not having the SRD? Because perhaps the poverty targeting role or efficacy of non-SRD grants may be greater than an SRD grant. And so you're in this game, in this policy game or policy thought experiment about which is the best grant for poverty reduction. That all then unfortunately, it's a tough discussion, but unfortunately is encapsulated in a fiscal envelope, right? Because if you go down the line of debt financing grants, right, which may be ethically, morally, and in terms of how we think about poverty alleviation, the best thing to do, we may end up in a fiscal constraint that we don't want to be in. And so all of these balls are in the air. Coming back to the initial starting point for our Monday event is to ask the question, can the SRD serve as an instrument for labor market activity? And our answer is, unfortunately, based on the sort of longer run evidence, not really, actually.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, with such high unemployment rate and the efforts to achieve inclusive economic development in our country, which is the single biggest challenge, I mean, should we be looking at grants per se, or should we be looking at a new form of stimulating job creation?
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question. So the point I've made many, many times that I think as a society, as an economy, we've done incredibly well in getting income and grants to households. And so much of our poverty alleviation strategy, our growth strategy even, has been focused on households, but less so on firms. And by firms, I mean everybody from the sort of one-person informal sector operator right through to the listed entity. And we almost need what I call supply-side economics of a good type that goes to small businesses and the informal sector, and in that way looks for incentives, deregulation, infrastructure support. That then provides the basis that's more sustainable to support the unemployed, for example, who want to start businesses. And that switches a policy discourse away from grants and households, where I think we've done already very well in terms of the child support grant and the old age pension, and that should stay there. But switch, if you think about the unemployed, to thinking about the supply side of the economy, to think about firms as a more sustainable route to creating employment-intensive growth.
Yeah, you may have answered this already or touched on it, but I want to come back to the calls for universal basic income grant, to target from age 16 all the way up to 50 for people who are unemployed. Could that feature in a scenario that tries to stimulate some kind of productive economic activity?
So I think so the answer we have on the basis of an SRD, if that's the closest we have as a replica to the BIG, to the big, is no. In a narrow sense, it's not really going to increase employment outcomes. It certainly won't increase search behaviors. Never mind employment outcomes, there's zero impact on job search, and there's muted impacts on starting a business. But in the long run, the effects are zero. So then we come back to, okay, what about a big for as part of a social grant strategy writ large, so an expanded social grant or social assistance net for South Africans? Then you've got to ask a different set of questions, which is, can we ensure that given the fiscal envelope, that these grants won't crowd out the real value or reduce the real value of other grants? So robbing Peter to pay Paul. So in other words, so we have to keep an eye on the fact that the CSG and the old age pension still do the good work they're doing without a reduction in their real value to pay for the SRD. You have to ask the question about whether we're taking on more interest, so the interest burden increases to debt finance the SRD. So there are all these complicated fiscal questions which are uncomfortable and they're difficult, but they do come there because it currently doesn't feature in the fiscal consolidation path of the Treasury. And so when you go in that direction, you ask the poverty questions and you have to ask the fiscal questions and then weigh them up.
And you're going to try and do that on Monday. It will be very interesting to see what will come out. And I would love to chat to you afterwards to see exactly what was achieved come this Monday at this policy debate. Thank you very much for your time, Prof, and your inputs and insights about this very important issue of rethinking traditional approaches to tackling unemployment in South Africa, especially using well-designed grant-based approaches for the unemployment to try and complement active labor market policies. We'll see what comes out of that. We'll follow. It's very important. Thank you very much, Professor Bhorat. Now,